Vlad the Impaler smiles as he dips his bread into a pool of fresh blood. Around him, a forest of wooden stakes stretches into the distance, each one bearing a still twitching human body. This isn't a scene from a vampire movie. It's a Tuesday afternoon for the real Prince of Wallachia. While our modern world romanticizes him as the inspiration for Dracula, the historical Vlad was something far more disturbing. A royal serial killer whose methods of torture would make modern psychopaths seem amateur. He didn't hide in shadows. He displayed his victims in town squares, parks, and along roadways. What history books won't tell you is that Vlad's legendary cruelty wasn't the product of madness, but a calculated political strategy endorsed by the very institutions that later condemned him. The true horror isn't just what he did, it's who helped him do it. The image we just saw shocks because it feels private, intimate, monstrous. Yet that exact image is almost entirely absent from the tidy stories taught in classrooms. You learned a different Vlad, a stoic defender of Christendom, a stern patriot, a bulwark against Ottoman expansion. Now we will walk through that comfortable version, the version polished for history books, tourist brochures, and Sunday sermons, and show how neat it seems really are. The classroom Vlad begins with a simple origin story. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, a scion of the Basarab lineage, he grows into a determined ruler. He inherits a volatile principality wedged between empires. Ottoman cavalry prowled the borders. Polish and Hungarian politics pulled strings. In the official line, his brutality is framed as a response, harsh measures demanded by harsh times. He is Teeps, the Impaler, but the name is translated by textbooks into a grim badge of necessary firmness. The moral is tidy. The ruler who used cruelty to keep invaders at bay saved a nation. This tidy arc is reinforced by familiar visual frames. The first frame is the map in the classroom, a flat, colored patch called Wallachia between the Ottoman and Hungarian spheres. A teacher points to arrows and dates. The second frame is the portrait, a gaunt man in armor, haloed by candlelight, labeled Defender of the Faith. The third frame is the heroic vignette, a battle against Turks, a castle held, villagers spared. These frames are comfortable. They make chaos legible. They close moral complexity with a neat caption. You saw this version in films and popular histories. Bram Stoker's Dracula provided a new layer. Fiction borrowed a name and grafted a romance onto it. Stoker's novel did not invent Vlad, it rebranded him. From there the machine went to work. Castle Brand became his castle in the tourist imagination. Museums mounted exhibits where the blood is a backdrop for nationhood. Schoolbooks, over generations, reproduced edited extracts from medieval chronicles that emphasized military deeds and underplayed domestic terror. A pattern formed, emphasize external threats, minimize internal cruelty. Here are the voices that taught the comfortable story. First, the textbook line. Vlad Teeps defended the Christian realms from Ottoman incursions. His severity stemmed from necessity and patriotism. Second, the pulpit line. He was stern but pious, a ruler of faith who defended his flock. Third, the nationalist line. He is the ancestor of modern Romanian liberty, who sacrificed personal morality for the survival of the people. These voices are concise, clean, and persuasive. They close moral ambivalence. The official narrative is not only tidy, it is also profitable. Nations like Romania gained a heroic ancestor to anchor emerging national identities. For centuries, Eastern European courts and later nationalist movements needed exemplars. Institutions that supplied legitimacy kingdoms, churches, emerging nation-states found in Vlad a symbol they could shape. The church could claim an image of a defender of the faith. Nationalists could claim a figure of resistance. The state could benefit from unity told as an origin myth. Even foreign actors benefited. Hungarian and imperial chroniclers could highlight his anti-Ottoman deeds when convenient, and later European sensationalists could turn him into Gothic material. This version works because it solves problems for many stakeholders. For a fragile principality, a ruthless protector is a rhetorical lifeline. For the Orthodox Church, a muscular defender can be recast into saintly imagery. For modern tourism, a marketable villain-hero hybrid sells tickets, tours, and branded trinkets. The result is a distributed incentive to keep the image neat. The cruelty becomes a footnote. The victories remain the headline. But this comfortable account depends on a selective attention. It asks readers to accept the compression of events and motives. It repairs contradictions by omission. When you study it carefully, you see the smoothing. Inconvenient victims vanish, internal terror becomes discipline, and the ruler's personal pleasures are framed as statecraft. That smoothing is the first trick of a successful myth. To make the myth emotionally persuasive, cultural production adds narrative devices. Paintings from monasteries of later centuries show a penitent ruler at prayer. Poems in nationalist campaigns present Vlad as solitary, tragic, burdened by the weight of saving a people. In cinema, gore is often stylized, turned into horror entertainment rather than understood as political technique. The myth thus migrates from archives to altars to silver screens, cross-pollinating religious reverence, national pride, and pop fascination. There are moments when the official story makes specific claims repeated across sources. It emphasizes battles against Turks. It highlights diplomatic correspondence with Hungary. It notes a stubborn refusal to bow to Ottoman tax demands. These claims have kernels of truth. Vlad did lead military actions and did, at times, resist Ottoman authority. But the emphasis in official retellings on foreign foes obscures scale and target of his violence. The story you learned did something else. It erased internal victims. In the classroom narrative, the enemies are almost always external. That framing hides the fact that the majority of his victims were his own people. That is a key omission and a telling one. When the myth speaks of harshness, it invites compassion for necessity. But necessity becomes a smokescreen when the state uses terror to purge domestic rivals and seize wealth. Consider how the myth repackages atrocity as moral calculus. Textbook phrasing often slides from "he punished traitors" to "he preserved order," as if the political purge were a technical response rather than an instrument for consolidating power. This rhetorical sleight of hand is simple. Use the language of defense to naturalize repression. Once normalized, such logic becomes available to future rulers in other contexts. That is one reason myths matter. They create templates. You might have seen artifacts of this editing without noticing. A museum placard calling him stern rather than sadistic. A guide recounting a tale of Dracula with a wink, glossing over the documented experiments on human bodies. A school chapter with a paragraph on battle and a footnote on internal punishments. The effect is cumulative. The memory of victims fades. The memory of defense endures. Now imagine the marketing logic. A post-communist Romania transformed Dracula into a tourism industry. The castle that rents costumes for Halloween provides undeniable economic benefit to local communities. When jobs and municipal budgets depend on the legend, the incentive to maintain a sanitized past is powerful. Similarly, literary and film industries sell an appealing monster. Once commodified, the historical figure becomes a global brand. Brands resist messy truths. They prefer simple narratives. It helps to see the official myth as a constructed product, not a neutral chronicle. It has designers, chroniclers, church leaders, nationalist historians, travel agents, filmmakers. Each edits. Each emphasizes a version that suits them. The myth survives because it is useful, but we must not conflate usefulness with truth. A narrative can be coherent and false in emphasis at the same time. The official Vlad is coherent for a national story. He is less coherent when measured against the contemporaneous records that describe interior terror and social destruction. Those other records, the ledger is not a heroic chronicle. It reads like an audit of a purge. Those who appear most often are boyars, merchants, rival commanders, Wallachians. The Forest of the Impaled, the famous image that tourists think of as punishment for invaders, is described in contemporary notes as dominated by locals. That observation flips the standard moral calculus. If your victims are your own people, the justification defense against invaders collapses into a politics of terror. Start with the simplest contradiction, timing. The neat story places Vlad's worst deeds as reactionary in response to Ottoman pressure. But the most notorious episodes predate the large-scale Ottoman campaigns that textbooks highlight. He impaled in peacetime and in moments of internal unrest. The action was proactive, designed to reshape society, not simply defend borders. That matters. It reframes cruelty from emergency measure to strategy. There are three lenses through which to read the discrepancies. First, chronology. Second, authorship of sources. Third, intended audience of those sources. Each lens reveals different motives for the stories that survived. Chronology first. The Easter Massacre, the mass impalements outside city gates. The police-like network of informants, many of these predate a major Ottoman offensive. In other words, Vlad was not only brutal during war. He used terror to preempt political threats. That suggests a logic of consolidation. Impale not because an army approaches, but because an own class could oppose you tomorrow. Authorship of sources is revealing. Many of the most sensational descriptions come from German-speaking Saxon merchants and envoys, from Ottoman diplomats compiling dossiers, and from Moldavian or Hungarian chroniclers with clear political reasons to either vilify or praise. Each wrote with an agenda. German accounts, angry at trade disruptions, amplified barbarism. Ottoman records labeled him treacherous. Wallachian official records, when available, present him as firm. The truth sits somewhere in these contested margins. But the pattern is telling. Accounts that recorded large-scale domestic violence were not isolated. They came from a wide spectrum of observers. The third lens, intended audience, explains why discrepancies were allowed to ossify. Chroniclers wrote for patrons who wanted stories that fit their politics. A Hungarian court that feared Ottoman expansion preferred a hero against the Turk narrative. A Saxon merchant affected by trade loss wanted a monster to blame. Later nationalist historians wanted an ancestor of the state. That audience shaping explains how the narrative was selectively transmitted. Now look at the scale. Numbers are fraught in medieval sources, but multiple accounts corroborate that impalement fields held hundreds or thousands. One foreign envoy wrote of a forest of thousands. Another noted that markets were emptying as people fled fear. Even allowing for exaggeration, the repeated images of columns of stakes and long rows of suffering point to mass campaigns, not isolated incidents. When the death toll becomes communal rather than individual, the event is political cleansing. Another fissure is the profile of victims. Merchants who refused to comply with extortion, boyars who resisted confiscations of land, clergy who failed to support him, women who turned down advances. These victims are not military enemy. They are social threats to centralized power. That pattern is consistent with purges elsewhere in history, where rulers weaponize public violence to eliminate rival networks and redistribute wealth to loyalists. Church reaction, or the lack of it, is its own contradiction. Vlad's cruelty, especially to Christians, violated orthodox norms of sanctity and death. Yet church chronologies show curious silences. Some monasteries later commissioned paintings praising him. Why didn't religious authorities protest more vocally? Several possibilities exist. One is fear. The church is a practical institution and may have survived by accommodation. Another is opportunism. The church gained land and position in the aftermath of purges. Both are plausible. Either way, silence becomes complicity, and complicity becomes an enabling factor in the myth-making that followed. There are also contradictions in the rhetoric of piety. In later hagiographic images, Vlad is kneeling, devout. In eyewitness reports, he dined among the dying. He celebrated hunts and inspected impalement fields as if they were trophies. The duality is stark, a ruler who prays in painted icons and enjoys suffering in practice. That discrepancy is at the core of the larger problem. How institutions sanitize images by extracting piety from a life that contained little. A subtler fissure appears in language. Consider titles and epithets. German broadsheets called him Dracula and Teeps interchangeably, and the terms drifted into folklore. The linguistic mobility allowed later storytellers to graft vampire motifs onto historical brutality. Language let the figure slip from political actor into mythical creature. That slippage helped conceal the political mechanics of his cruelty. It turned a policy into a parable. Next, examine the infrastructure of terror. This is not speculation. It is attested indirectly by administrative notes and travel reports. There are lists of informants and rewards for reporting neighbors. One letter mentions a corps of watchers, men paid to surveil, interrogate, and hand over suspects. Another note references experiments, certain methods of impalement, which body placement prolonged suffering for maximum psychological effect. These details, while chilling, indicate systematization. This is not random cruelty, but a bureaucratic approach to violence. It reads like a module in a larger governance toolkit. Imagine this network as a machine. Spies feeding reports, executioners following a protocol, public displays designed for maximum terror. The machine required resources, wood for stakes, guards for enforcement, officials to seize property. The very scale of resource allocation indicates intent beyond immediate defense. The state redirected economic and human capital into a program of coercion. That is an uncomfortable truth that the official myth smooths over. Another contradiction concerns alliances and betrayals. Vlad's early life included being held as a hostage at Ottoman courts. He spoke Turkish fluently and was, at times, an Ottoman client. Yet later retellings emphasize anti-Ottoman heroism. The reality is messier. Alliances shifted based on opportunity. Sometimes Vlad sought Ottoman favor, sometimes he defied them. This pragmatic toggling undermines the clean religious narrative that paints his actions as crusade. Instead, it suggests a leader driven by survival, revenge, and personal vendettas, human motivations that don't fit sanitized national narratives. Consider individual vignettes. Foreign merchants who refused to bow to local customs were sometimes punished in grotesque ways. Nails through hats, public humiliation, worse. These stories illustrate an important point. Many acts attributed to state policy were also personal displays of humiliation. They served two purposes at once: enforcing rules and satisfying private appetites for dominance. The dual-use quality of violence, political and personal, is another tear in the myth. Sources also diverge on the nature of his military campaigns. Some chronicles celebrate tactical daring. Others note short-sighted raids that provoked reprisals. At times Vlad allied with Hungary. At others he negotiated with Ottoman commanders. The inconsistency dissolves the image of a single-minded defender. It replaces it with a portrait of a leader improvising, bargaining, and reacting not always for the nation, sometimes for personal or dynastic advantage. Layering all these inconsistencies creates a new picture. The man in power was less a holy warrior than a political actor using terror as a tool to reorder society. His aims included dismantling rival power structures, appropriating wealth, and building a loyalist class. The result: immediate compliance, long-term destabilization. Economically, markets suffered. Socially, elites were decimated. Politically, the state became brittle because it depended on fear rather than consensus. That outcome contradicts the official claim that the brutality stabilized the realm. How did the myth survive this evidence? through a process of redaction and rebranding. After Vlad's death, the ledger of victims was edited, the calendars reoriented, the art commissioned. The result is a layered portrait where the public face pious, patriotic, severe masks a governance built on terror and self-preservation. The official narrative is, therefore, not merely incomplete. It is often misleading. This recognition raises immediate questions. If the sanitized image of Vlad was constructed consciously, who profited? If the machinery of terror left lasting damage, how did the nation rebuild itself on a foundation of fear? And, most pressing for us now, when politicians in the 21st century invoke a strong Vlad, are we hearing a historical argument or the echo of a myth repurposed to justify repression? Those are the threads we will pull next. Mourning in Vlad's court began like a ritual, but not the kind the church would recognize. The prince moved through rooms that smelled of grease and smoke, of iron and recently cut wood. He passed guarded thresholds where men and male cleaned blood from their hands, and where servants swept discarded scraps of food from long tables. Outside, the damp of the river rose in thin veils. Inside, there was a different humidity, sweat, fear, and the metallic odor of fresh wounds. Councils assembled beneath low beams, advisors bowed, and the conversation turned, as it always did, toward one steady drumbeat: obedience. A visitor who expected banners and bright tapestries found instead the blunt choreography of deterrence. Accounts from the period, foreign envoys, merchant letters, a few surviving administrative notes describe a throne room where the spectacle of punishment was woven into governance. A corpse on display at the doorway, a column of stakes seen through the archways like a wooden grove, and the quiet, deliberate presence of men whose job was not to argue, but to ensure that argument ended. The effect was clinical, a public demonstration, repeated until compliance felt inevitable. Those who came to advise learned, quickly, that dissent had a price stamped into the room's very layout. You can imagine the scene as a sequence of small rituals: the prince's arrival, the hush, the rustle of velvet and chain mail, the shifting glances toward the windows where keepers adjusted ropes and poles. Those shifts were language. They said, "We know how to make defiance visible. We know how to turn resistance into a lesson that travels by sight." The private life of a ruler can be a rumor machine. Vlad's private life was also a set of commands. He did not live as some ascetic prince walled off from pleasures. Chroniclers note marriages and a succession of companions, and, in a darker register, stories of women who fled rather than stay. One tale framed in later sources as tragic, perhaps to humanize him, says his first wife leapt from a tower into the cold river, too frightened to remain. Whether literal truth or metaphor, the image does the political work of explaining two things at once: a man forged by early loss, and a household governed by fear. Those close to him, servants and guests, learned quickly that intimate refusal could become a public display. Refuse in advance, and the offense mutated into treasonous moral failure. The instruments of power were not only soldiers and advisors, they were systems. Examination of administrative notes and the occasional letter reveals an apparatus that reads like a proto-bureaucracy of terror. Rewards were recorded for informants. Lists brief, clipped, typically only a few lines per entry, detail confiscated estates and the fates of named individuals. One dispatch, preserved in a Hanseatic merchant log, speaks of men sent to find loyalty, and of firewood bought in bulk for public works. The economy rearranged itself. Stakes required logs, executioners required shoes, watchmen required coin. The machinery converted human life into ledger lines. Perhaps the most forensic detail, and the one that chills modern readers, is the language of experimentation. Reports, some hostile, others merely practical, describe measuring survival times, noting the effect of different impalement techniques. A phrase appears in more than one account: we tested the best gauge for slow death. Whether Vlad himself penned such phrases matters less than the fact the phrase circulates among trade and diplomatic networks. The practice was methodical. It had iterations. It had record keepers. Why would a ruler collect such data? The immediate, cynical answer is that he was perfecting deterrence, finding how to make punishment visible and long-lasting enough to be instructive. A subtler interpretation is that the act of measuring converted cruelty into statecraft. When pain becomes information, it steps into the category of governance. It becomes policy. The blood was not merely spectacle. It was exploration. These practices fed a wider surveillance ecosystem. The Corps of Watchers, a term that appears in one mercantile report and is echoed in diplomatic memoranda, functioned as running surveillance. Men were paid to report infractions, betrayals, price fixing, disrespect, and, crucially, whispers of plots. Reward systems were calibrated to prioritize denouncements that led to property seizures. The arithmetic is brutal and efficient. Suspicion yields confiscation, confiscation rewards informants, and the social map redraws itself along lines of dependence. Who once owned land saw it pass to men whose loyalty was transactional. Patronage replaced lineage. This apparatus needed technicians. Executioners were not amateurs. They were craftsmen of death. Chronicles, sometimes moralizing, sometimes fascinated, describe configurations of stakes, poles, and ropes arranged to ensure not immediate death, but prolonged visibility. Shock worked in multiple registers. It terrorized, it humiliated, and it taught. Executioners learned which placements produced the longest communal watching. It was, in the language of those documents, effective. The pattern extended inward. The court practiced ritualized entrapment of guests. One diplomat's letter, written to a merchant's guild, recounts a famous humiliation. Foreign traders who refused the local protocol of hat removal were nailed to their hats, an act both cruel and theatrical. The detail is vivid because it moves beyond abstract terror into personalized degradation. This was punishment with a performance component. It communicated rank and bespoke humiliation. The message was multi-layered. Defy local custom, and you will be turned into an object lesson, useful to all. What drove these practices had antecedents in the prince's own history. Vlad's childhood, spent as a hostage at the Ottoman court, surfaces in almost every account that tries to explain him. The image of a boy or young man, watching a dominant culture practice its power rituals deprived of agency, repeatedly reminded of vulnerability lingers in the narratives. That experience can create many possible adult reactions: fear, accommodation, resentment, or fury. In Vlad's case, the sources converge on control, an obsessive need to preempt betrayal. He learned, as a child, that not obeying could mean death. As ruler, he insisted on converting that lesson into a formal strategy. We should not flatten cause and effect. Childhood mistreatment does not make inevitability, but patterns of trauma can channel choices. A man who had seen himself powerless might choose to transform the state into an engine of certainty. Certainty, once assembled, is easier to tax, to conscript, to command. The emotional logic fear turned into micromanagement fits the documentary trace. Vlad personally ordered stakes, inspected their sharpness, and sometimes tested their efficacy. An advisor's note, terse and perhaps mocking, reports that he insisted on feeling how a shaft cleaved meat before approving a method. That detail, if true, moves us from policy to pathology. It is the difference between an act designed to coerce and one performed for unmistakable personal gratification. The court's social engineering was comprehensive. Dinners served both to negotiate and to entrap. Guests were invited into designed moral traps, small taboos or tests of obedience that, when failed, provided justification for public punishment. This is a very old political trick. Make a transgression visible, then sanctify the punishment as moral correction. But the cruelty in Vlad's court was disproportionate. The punishments did not correspond. The economy rearranged itself around fear. Markets emptied as merchants fled, trade routes rerouted to avoid checkpoints, and tax revenues fluctuated with the human cost. The state redirected resources not to fortifications against external foes, but toward maintaining the spectacle of punishment. Wood, nails, labor, all became inputs to the engine of intimidation. There is also a performative mastery in how the prince managed narratives. He invited observers, Saxon merchants, Venetian envoys, Hungarian emissaries to witness certain ceremonial acts. We can imagine him leading skeptical visitors through lines of poles, explaining their utility with a courteous smile. The point was not to hide, but to display a public knowing that violence could be orchestrated with elegance. For some observers, the show invoked horror. For others, it invoked calculation, a ruler doing what needed to be done. The difference between revulsion and admiration often depended on what the observer wanted to be true. And yet, for all this organization, contradictions persisted. There are accounts of Vlad negotiating with Ottoman commanders, of him speaking Turkish fluently, of shifting allegiances depending on immediate advantage. The notion that he was a crusader in shining armor dissolves in the face of these practical toggles. He was neither ideologue nor pure patriot. He was a political actor in a messy geopolitical environment, and he used whatever means seemed serviceable to centralize power, sometimes doing business with those he later fought. The pattern is not random. A network of watchers, executioners, spies, and compliant clerics looks less like a man improvising in crisis and more like an organized governance model built on fear. When you trace it from the childhood hostage episode, through the personal inspections of stakes, to the economic rerouting and the doctored sermons, the portrait becomes chillingly coherent. This was a system designed to reduce unpredictability by converting it into spectacle. The human cost was enormous. The political calculus was stark. At the edge of these workings was a ritual that would come to define his rule, the staged reconciliation that would end in massacre. The gears of surveillance and humiliation, the core of watchers and the inventories of stakes, the church's quiet bargains and the merchant's complaints, all pointed to a single outcome. A public moment where the lesson of obedience would be learned in the most irreversible way. The court, practiced in both coercion and theater, was ready for that culmination. What followed would not be an accident of cruelty. It would be the logical and terrifying expression of a regime that had perfected punishment into policy. Easter, 1457 opens on a promise. Forgiveness, a feast, the cleansing rites of a holy day. Invitations went out to boyar houses across Wallachia. The language was carefully sacral and familial. "Come in the spirit of reconciliation," the messengers said. The words themselves were performative, designed to weaken suspicion and encourage attendance. For years, nobles had measured threat by rumor and distance. Invitations from the prince's palace carried a peculiar gravity. Nobody invited could easily refuse, especially when refusal could be framed as defiance of holy intent. The day itself starts with sensory overload. Imagine the castle at dawn, banners raised, the clamor of loading and unloading, cooks turning spits over wide fires. The air was thick with smoke and the sweetness of roasted meat. The feast hall glowed with candles, the carved beams polished to a soft sheen. Boyars, their families, retainers, and servants moved in a choreography that suggested temporary peace. Guests traded courtesy and small talk. Children darted between tables. Old men compared tales of winters survived and rulers seen. The aesthetic of normalcy, in such scenes, creates a double shock when it is broken. That is precisely the effect Vlad sought. You see, the trick of public cruelty is that it must feel utterly ordinary before it becomes extraordinary. The banquet served as the ritual curtain. It distracted the senses and lowered the index of suspicion. A prince who welcomes you with bread and salt can be a miracle, A prince who asks a question after the meal can be a surgeon deciding who to excise. The question Vlad asked was simple and conversational. How many rulers have you seen in your lifetimes? A seemingly innocent, perhaps even jocular, inquiry, one of those icebreakers at noble feasts. But in that moment a truth was revealed. Those who had served under many dynasties were, in Vlad's eyes, likely to be adaptable to any regime. For a man obsessed with loyalty, adaptability equaled disposability. The answer, the number of rulers they'd served, became a litmus. Old boyars, with long careers and broad networks, were now statistically more dangerous. Guards moved. It happened with the same mechanical efficiency the corps of watchers had displayed in less lethal tasks. Men at the doors locked them. Riders posted outside closed gateways. The guests had no time for panic. Apprehension, in such spaces, often gives way to bewildered compliance. Humans are trained to obey until they fail, and to attempt escape only when the costs are obvious. What followed was not a trial. There was no need for one in a system that had already reconstructed guilt as a matter of past service. Arrests were swift and final. Old boyars and their family members were separated from the young, who at first did not comprehend the meaning of the men's absence. Husbands were pulled from the hall into shadowed corridors. Wives and daughters, in many accounts, were not killed immediately, but sent to work battalions, forced labor that stripped dignity before the body was reached. That escalation, the forced labor preceding execution, served both as punishment and as spectacle preparation. Exhausted bodies wasted faster, and their impalement extended the theater of suffering. Outside the castle, the landscape was prepared. Stakes had been sharpened and stained. Men moved in a practiced cadence. Pit dug, pole set, victims seated or tied, then lifted. Impalement itself was grotesquely technical. Chroniclers debate the particulars of technique, entry angle, insertion depth, and the positioning that prolongs consciousness. But descriptions converge on the same awful conclusion. The procedures were engineered for duration and visibility. The spectacle was partial, bodies roped upward, the slow sinking, the stretch of limbs in the harsh air. For a crowd, the effect was a cruel lesson written in the language all could read: obedience, under pain, made permanent. It is here that the numerical claims become crucial. Contemporary observers' figures vary. Foreign envoys used hyperbole. Local records minimized proportions. One Western diplomatic letter speaks of thousands in a forest of stakes. Other accounts, more conservative, enumerate hundreds. Modern historians estimate the event scale in the low hundreds, perhaps nearly 500 elite victims, when adding family members and dependents. Numbers do not dilute horror, they contextualize it. Hundreds of elite family heads disappeared in a single day. Houses changed ownership overnight. That transfer of property is as meaningful as the bodies on poles. Land ended up in hands that owed everything to the prince. The immediate political consequence was surgical. Hereditary networks that could assemble troops, gather resources, or foment conspiracies were annihilated. In the vacuum, Vlad installed men whose loyalty depended on him alone: mercenaries, bureaucrats, and those who had accepted seized property. The state apparatus shifted towards centralization by fear. Loyalty, in the new order, was less about shared history and more a ledger of patrimony. You served because your livelihood, and often your life, depended on it. Neighboring powers watched with mixed reactions. Some saw an efficient purging of corrupt elites. Others saw a ruler who had just hollowed out the institutional resilience of his own polity. The latter risk was real. A state run on terror tends to crack under external pressure because it lacks durable social cohesion. The boyars had not only been rivals, they were local administrators, tax collectors, and military mobilizers. With them gone or cowed, the administrative capacity of Wallachia suffered. Trade routes that had been policed by local magnates fell into disorder. Markets dried as merchants fled the uncertainty. The supposed strengthening through brutality turned, paradoxically, the former traveled privately, whispered among merchants and soldiers. The latter marched through formal channels and then crucially into art, libraries, and chronicles. The same hands that planned the slaughter now planted seeds for its interpretation. That planting would grow, over decades, into a myth convenient for those who benefited. In the immediate term, silence and fear muffled the most potent backlash. Families were forbidden to mourn publicly. Property seizures were legalized with decrees. The public sphere contracted under the weight of grief and caution. Yet cleanup of social systems required more than decrees. The new men of power, bureaucrats and commanders promoted from the ashes had to be taught the language of loyalty. They were rewarded with titles and lands. More importantly, they received legitimizing stories. They would be inscribed in official records as the prince's faithful servants, protectors in a time of chaos. The narrative was not only about Vlad's deeds. It was now about the necessity of order and the dangerous luxury of dissent. Each promoted man had an interest in preserving a memory that made his rise appear virtuous. Those promoted watched the borders too. They negotiated, sometimes cleverly, with Hungary and the Ottoman frontier. But internally, trust eroded. When power is redistributed through violence, all subsequently political moves must compensate for the original rupture. Alliances become fragile because the memory of dispossession animates old loyalties into grudges. The assassination of a ruler becomes, in that environment, less an exceptional act and more a political commonplace. After the massacre, some contemporaries composed laments, others penned pragmatic endorsements. The memory was mutable. For Vlad's supporters, the event was evidence of hard resolve that saved the principality from greater chaos. For his victims and their survivors, it was the day the fabric of their community was shredded. For later storytellers, it provided the kernel around which myths of a stern ruler defending his realm could be assembled. But facts linger. The massacre left fingerprints on institutions, land ownership, trade, and memory. It revealed not simply the cruelty of an individual, but the capacity of a polity to adopt terror as governance. The long-term consequences, economic disruption, weakened local administration, and a populace reshaped by fear outlived any immediate strategic advantage. In the aftermath, the region was easier to manage centrally, yes, but also more fragile under external pressure. The choice to terrorize yielded compliance in the short run and instability in the long run. The reckoning we face from history is not only moral, it is structural. How do societies rebuild when their elites are erased? How do markets reform when trust is weaponized? These are the questions that matter beyond the gore. Vlad's Easter was more than an event of atrocity. It was an institutional experiment whose negative results echo in the ruin it left behind. And yet the story would be transformed, muffled, and reconstituted because power not only kills, it edits its own record. As news of the massacre traveled, different audiences read different meanings into it. Some foreign courts, eager for allies, framed it as necessary purgation. Merchants whispered fear into their ledgers and recalculated risks. The human consequence, grief, exile, the haunting memory of Poles in a field did not disappear. But over time, public memory was smoothed. How that smoothing happened is the next piece of the puzzle, the organized, often cynical machinery that rewrites and repackages atrocity into a usable narrative. The massacre's immediate horror would be allowed to age into a story convenient for kings, churches, and, later, for popular culture. Death, when it is dramatic, invites explanation. Explanation becomes a commodity. The immediate political aftermath of the Easter massacre was chaotic. What followed, an organized campaign of reinterpretation, was deliberate. Memory needed tending. It needed gardeners who could transplant narratives, prune inconvenient facts, and cultivate useful legends. The machinery of propaganda does not operate solely through speeches. It works by seeding institutions, scribes, monks, chroniclers, artists, and later playwrights and novelists so that certain images propagate and others fade. In the decades after Vlad's death in 1476, the first tendrils of rehabilitation took root. Hungarian chroniclers, writing in an atmosphere of Ottoman anxiety, found in Vlad a useful exemplar. They could present him as a hard hand that slowed an advancing empire. In so doing, they traded a fuller account his domestic purges and the victims who bore Christian names for a sanitized tale of strategic stubbornness. The chroniclers had a motive: present a hero against the Ottoman threat. The work of selective remembrance is astonishingly simple. Amplify what fits, omit what doesn't, and repeat until silence covers absence. The Orthodox Church, too, performed its own edit. Institutional silence during the massacres had been politically expedient. After the prince's death, the Church took a more accommodative posture, recasting him as a defender of the faith. Paintings commissioned in monasteries began to show him kneeling before Christ, haloed in artifice and prayer. Hagiographic modes, images designed to make saints legible, began to envelop his portrait. The question of complicity: how many monasteries benefited from seized land, how many clerics stayed silent for survival, was softened by the new imagery. The Church's reinterpretation served multiple aims. It fortified social order, validated patronage, and provided a model of sanctified strength for a people needing heroes. Artworks matter because they outlast rhetoric. A painted icon of a pious ruler can hang for centuries. A pamphlet loses its edge after a generation. By commissioning images that framed Vlad as liturgical patron and holy defender, monastic patrons shifted the context in which the public would encounter his memory. Visual art is slow to correct itself. Once a painted image aligns with collective identity, it becomes a cognitive shortcut, proof in pigment of a story's veracity. Secular historians and nationalist intellectuals further reified the myth in subsequent centuries. As Romanian identity coalesced against Ottoman influence, 19th-century nationalists sought progenitors, figures in whom to concentrate pride. They found Vlad both evocative and malleable. Textbooks began to treat him as a proto-national hero, teaching children a version of events that emphasized external threats and excused internal measures as regrettable but necessary. Curricula smoothed contradictions. Lessons compress complex motivations into easy moral arcs. The prince who saved the nation. One of the decisive cultural moves occurred when Bram Stoker, writing in 1897, brushed across his pages a name, Dracula, that had, by then, already accumulated a mix of legend and history. Stoker did not construct a documentary biography. He wrote Gothic fiction. Yet fiction has a gravitational pull in the public imagination. It recasts historical names into archetypes. Vlad's persona, grafted onto a creature of the night, became internationalized. The vampire narrative recoded his image from temporal ruler to eternal symbol, and in the popular mind, vampirism blurred with tyrannical rule. The blood-soaked prosecutions that had been political became, in a subtle and insidious way, theatricalized. Horror rebranded atrocity. Commerce sealed the deal. Tourism, especially after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, discovered Dracula. Castle Bran, whose historical links to Vlad are tenuous at best, was repurposed as Dracula's castle. The economics are straightforward. Tourists buy spookiness. Cities began to rely on visitors who wanted to see the myth rendered in stone, media, and souvenirs. And when livelihoods hinge on a particular story, an incentive forms not to complicate it. Guides learned narratives that sold. Municipal budgets leaned into the legend. The local economy, now partially dependent on an edited past, had material reasons to keep the narrative tidy. There are more mundane, but no less effective mechanics at work in propaganda. Documents were edited, chronicles were revised, where a record noted mass impalements of Christian nobles. A later retelling might call them annual festivals, church commemorations, and civic celebrations embed a sanctioned memory into the communal calendar. Celebrate a hero's feast day, and the stories align. Question the feast day, and one is accused of undermining national unity. Rituals naturalize narratives through repetition. They make forgetfulness into a civic virtue. Ritualized memory becomes a social pressure system that is harder to counter than a single text. Media modernization multiplied the effect. Prints, then newspapers, then cinema, turned myth into a product. Films that borrowed the Dracula name sanitized, sensationalized, and exported an image that prioritized dramatic allure over historical complexity. Hollywood's global reach remade Vlad into an icon detached from concrete politics. When a villain becomes a brand, the historical particulars lose traction under the weight of merchandising. You can buy a refrigerator magnet with a cartoon stake and never realize how many lives lie behind the image. The end result of these layered strategies is a public sphere where the unpleasant facts, the domestic victims, the bureaucratic apparatus of terror, the church's quiet bargains are minimized or repurposed. The greater the profit, political, economic, emotional, the greater the incentive to polish the narrative. Sins become strategies, atrocities become footnotes. Institutions that once benefited from the outcomes of the terror had every reason to cultivate the hero story. It is tempting to assign blame to a single actor, the cunning court chronicler, or the ambitious nationalist historian. But propaganda is an ecology. It requires supply and demand. The supply includes texts, paintings, sermons, and films. The demand comes from nations seeking origins, churches wanting defenders, and markets hungry for tales. When all these elements align, a manufactured memory ossifies into received truth. There is a moral economy in forgetting. The people who inherit social positions after purges have every incentive to maintain the story that justified their ascent. The cleric who gains land wants a saintly patron in painted robes. The merchant who profits from Dracula tourism wants a spooky, uncomplicated villain. The foreign diplomat who needs stable borders values narratives that promise heroic defense. Each actor's self-interest creates a collective amnesia. Yet, for the historian, the process is visible, and the traces remain if one looks. Marginal accounts, letters tucked away in archives, contradictory chronicles, these are the raw materials that resist complete erasure. The work of revision and reinvention always leaves collateral marks. A ledger line here, a merchant's angry letter there. Those fragments are the archaeologist's prize. They allow us to reconstruct an alternative memory, a memory that acknowledges both resistance to external foes and the internal machinery of violence. This reconstruction does not negate Vlad's role in frontier conflicts, nor does it absolve the complex geopolitical pressures of the time. What it does is insist on nuance. He can have fought Ottomans and also presided over domestic terror. He can have been pious in painted icons and grotesque in practice. The propaganda edifice is powerful because it reduces complexity into a usable story. But when that story becomes the basis for justifying modern political choices, when politicians invoke a strong Vlad to defend authoritarian measures, they tap into a lineage that confuses brutal consolidation with legitimate defense. The final irony is that the very institutions that once benefited from sanitizing the past now claim to defend truth. Museums display artifacts that celebrate heroism while glossing over victims. School texts tout valor while omitting names of the dead. The marketplace profits from the narrative while the moral residue of the original acts is commodified into kitsch. After decades, centuries, and a torrent of cultural production, what remains? A marketable Dracula, a nationalized hero, an embattled church, and a tourist economy built on a mythicized past. The man who stood beside forests of Poles is both more prosaic and more horrifying than the vampire caricature or the national anthem figure. He is a case study in how atrocity can be neutralized in public memory by interests that benefit from simplification. When one dismantles the appliance of propaganda piece by piece, the result is not a simple villain and not a simple hero. It is a human being embedded in systems political, economic, religious that enabled and then repackaged his cruelty. That is the uncomfortable truth propaganda tries to hide. The violence was not merely a private pathology. It was social labor that required cooperation and silence. Standing at the end of this investigation into the machine, the question is not whether Vlad was cruel. Historical consensus and contemporary reports make that plain. The question is why societies allowed cruelty to be smoothed into a story fit for children's books and souvenir shops. The answers are practical, political, and mercenary. Profit, identity, fear, convenience. Those forces still operate today. No propaganda edifice is invulnerable. New documents leak, new scholars sift archives, and new storytellers choose complexity over simplification. But the economy of myth-making persists so long as there is benefit to be had. That is why the work of re-examining is both dangerous and necessary. Dangerous because it upsets comfortable narratives. Necessary because a citizenry's memory shapes its future choices. The next step is to ask, what does an honest portrait of Vlad look like once we strip away the varnish? If propaganda sculpted the public face, how do we reconstruct the human, the political, and the systemic truth beneath? The answer is neither clean nor consoling, but it is the only account that helps us recognize how myth and power continue to shape our present. When the varnish is stripped away and the cameras stop flattering brushstrokes of legend, Vlad appears not as a mythic avatar, but as a complicated, dangerous human being full of motives that were personal as much as political, full of methods that were deliberate and theatrical, and full of consequences that were structural and long-lived. The honest portrait begins with small, sharp facts, and then widens into the patterns they form. A man forged by hostage childhoods and dynastic betrayals, who learned early that power could be held at the end of a spear and sharpened on a stake. Start with character. Contemporary observers, both hostile and sympathetic, agree on certain details. Vlad possessed a magnetic intensity, a capacity to command immediate obedience, and an appetite for spectacle. These are not judgments about moral valence, but descriptions of style. Witness accounts paint him as someone who relished the theater of rulership, a court that staged fear, a ruler who used presence as policy. You can imagine a morning council, sunlight dragging across a table of maps, the clink of goblets, the prince's face half-shadowed as he points, and the room tightens like a fist. That presence became his instrument. But alongside presence sits a darker interior. Multiple chronicles, notably German and Saxon reports written by merchants and envoys, repeat the same haunting detail, an apparent inability to feel ordinary compassion for the suffering of people around him. Those chroniclers, writing with their own biases, describe meals near squads of dying men, jokes told in the stench of blood. Clinical labels are modern and must be used cautiously, yet patterns align with what psychology now recognizes as elements of sadistic personality, deriving reward from domination, staging humiliation, and systematizing pain. The archival record contains instances where punishments are tailored to produce maximal display. A merchant's refusal to remove a hat becomes a nailed hat. An oath broken becomes a public slow death. These are not spontaneous cruelties. They are calibrated performances. Objectives are the second axis. The myth insists Vlad was driven by national religion and defense of the faith. The evidence suggests something messier. Yes, Vlad fought Ottomans on multiple occasions, and those battles mattered to Wallachhia's precarious survival. But his internal strategy, his domestic campaigns, followed a clearer arithmetic. neutralize hereditary power that could challenge his rule, redistribute its material foundations to loyalists, and make defiance physically costly. Property records after his reign show sudden transfers of land, decrees legitimizing conflict, and the impact, both immediate and structural, was profound. In the short term, power did centralize. Loyalists took seats at estates carved from the dispossessed. The prince's direct control over revenues increased. But those gains were brittle. Wallachia became administratively dependent on men whose loyalty had been purchased by dispossession. Local governance, traditionally mediated by hereditary families, fractured. Markets felt the shock. Merchants fled routes where patronage could not be guaranteed. Military mobilization suffered in the medium term. The boyars who raised troops and policed borders were either dead, cowed, or alienated. At the level of social psychology, the Easter Massacre and other acts produced a grammar of silence. Communities learned not to mourn publicly. They learned to censor conversation. That kind of social retrenchment is cheap for a momentary tyrant. Immediate compliance. Long-term, it thins the social fabric. The state that survives on fear also loses the networks that make governance resilient. The record bears this out in later decades. Instability returns. Foreign powers find easy purchase in internal divisions, and dynastic continuity is harder to maintain. Yet historians must also resist the temptation to flatten complexity into one label. There are contradictory fragments that complicate a portrait of pure malice. Reports exist of Vlad's strict enforcement of law in markets, of a desire to prevent theft policies that, if you accept the sources at face value, increased a sense of public safety in certain quarters. There are also diplomatic choices that look calculated to preserve state survival. Temporary alliances with Ottomans when strategic, hard lines when necessary. These actions complicate a biography that would present him as either a saint or a monster. The honest portrait holds both, punitive methods coupled with occasional administrative competence and tactical flexibility. How to weigh the sources? Some are clearly propagandistic. German pamphlets aiming to blacken an enemy. Hungarian chronicles that swing between praise and tactical silence, depending on political utility. The safest historiographical posture is one of calibrated confidence. Treat the repetitive, independently attested patterns, the institutional use of terror, the property transfers, the silence of religious authorities as strongly supported. Treat graphic anecdotes, especially those from highly charged polemical sources, as probable but not unassailable. Mark disputes where they exist. The result is not a comfortable portrait. It is a dossier, human, strategic, cruel, and consequential. If you learn Vlad as a hero who defended Christianity or as a Gothic villain with fangs, this reconstruction should unsettle you. It puts the emphasis on systems, how a ruler can harness theater, law, and bureaucracy to remake a polity. It also returns the moral weight where it belongs, not merely on a single man's temperament, but on the choices of institutions that enabled him: clerics who stayed silent, scribes who filed new decrees, courtiers who accepted seized lands. The honest portrait refuses to mythologize and refuses to reduce. It says, plainly, that a crowned serializer of violence existed within a functioning state apparatus, and that both the man and the machinery shaped history. There is another layer still. How this person, complex, terrible, human, was then turned into something else entirely by memory makers. That transformation did not erase his deeds, it repackaged them. To understand that process is to see how power sanitizes itself for future use. And that remaking of memory is the place where the past reaches forward to create the present we live in. But before we trace that reach, we must look at the ways the memory was manufactured, how chronicles, churches, artists, and later merchants polished a story that would serve them all. The next scene in this investigation is the machinery that built the myth and what it chose to bury. You have seen the man more clearly now, Vlad as ruler, strategist, sadist, and bureaucratic organizer of terror. What followed his death was not merely the closing of a career, but the opening of an industry, the industry of memory. Memory is not passive, it is manufactured. In the decades and centuries after Vlad's fall, a layered, multi-institutional operation set about to edit, reframe, and commodify his story. This process, fast, opportunistic, and multimodal, explains how a political actor who presided over domestic mass violence became the palimpsest for national myth and, later, a global brand. Begin with immediate political incentives. In the late 15th century, Eastern Europe lived under a daily calculus of survival. Hungarian rulers needed exemplars of resistance against Ottoman expansion. A brutal, uncompromising prince who had at times checked Turkish raids was politically useful. Hungarian chroniclers, writing in courts where Ottoman threat sharpened identity, had incentives to emphasize the military virtues and downplay the domestic terror. Reports were selected, highlighted, and reiterated in diplomatic dispatches that then spread through court networks. The mechanism is simple and old. Pick a story that rallies allies. Omit what complicates it. Religious institutions followed another pattern. The Orthodox Church, surprised, compromised, and hungry for patronage, found posthumous utility in sanctifying a warrior prince. Paintings and icons from the 16th century begin to depict Vlad in votive poses, kneeling, carrying banners, standing under Christ's gaze. The effect is powerful because visual culture outlasts many texts. An icon is a theological argument rendered in pigment. Where complicated legal archives gather dust, a painted image of pious patronage hangs in a monastery chapel and settles into community memory. The clerical voice added moral cover for a political narrative, a violent prince reframed as a pious protector. Legal and bureaucratic moves embedded the myth in paperwork. Property seizures, once performed under duress, were legalized through decrees that reclassified dispossession as punishment of traitors or corrupt elements. Those decrees outlived rulers. They entered registries. They created legal continuity that, over time, made the new proprietors stakeholders in the myth. If your title to land depended on a narrative of cleansing, you had an interest in preserving that narrative. This is the quiet genius of propaganda. It converts stories into contracts and contracts into incentives for silence. Education and nationalist historiography cemented the next layer. As modern Romania's national identity consolidated in the 19th century, intellectuals hunted progenitors, figures on whom to hang the drama of nationhood. Vlad fit perfectly. Remote, violent, effective. Scholars and schoolbooks smoothed inconsistencies. Complex, ambivalent histories became tidy morality plays. The foreign enemy is externalized. Domestic brutality is recoded as necessary. Classrooms repeat the tale. Children learn it as civic scaffolding. Over generations, a sanitized Vlad becomes the cognitive shorthand for required toughness in a threatened polity. Then culture went to work. Bram Stoker's Dracula is the most consequential cultural pivot. Stoker did not write a historical biography. He composed Gothic fiction that borrowed a name and a spectral sense of the past. Yet fiction has gravitational power. The vampire myth detached Vlad from his historical specificity and fused his name with archetype. The monster's traits, nocturnal, parasitic, charismatic, shifted public perception away from documented political terror toward the aesthetic of the monstrous. Films and novels then globalized this figure, translating local history into universal Gothic tropes. Economics completed the package. After communism's collapse, post-communist Romania found in Dracula a marketing bonanza. Castle brand cast as Dracula's castle with tenuous historical grounding became an international attraction. Tourism converted a national ambivalence into revenue. Gift shops sell playful stakes, t-shirts, and themed tours that prize spectacle over scrutiny. The market motivation is blunt. A spooky, marketable villain brings tourists. The more the story entertains, the more money flows. And once livelihoods depend on a simplified story, local interests resist more complex histories that might scare historians who follow these fragments reconstruct an alternate topology of memory, one that insists Vlad's terror had collateral beneficiaries, and that those beneficiaries became curators of his legend. The cultural effect is paradoxical. On one plane, the myth performs community building. It provides a symbolic bodyguard, a figure who stands between the nation and its dangers. On another plane, it normalizes coercion. It teaches that ruthless consolidation is sometimes legitimate, that the price of order can be cruelties. We can watch this double script playing out in 20th century politics. Ceausescu's speeches, for instance, invoked a certain tough past as justification for severe modern measures. Far-right groups twine the image of Vlad into rhetoric about borders and purity. The figure of this strong man, appealing in his simplicity, becomes a political shorthand for ends that justify means. Then there is the culture industry's feedback loop. Films, shows, games, and souvenirs reinforce what schools teach. Schools echo the sanitized chronicles. Officials cite the sanitized school narratives as evidence for policy. The myth becomes sticky. It acquires inertia. It does not merely reflect history. It channels contemporary politics. And finally, the personal. Walk a modern Romanian street during high tourist season. You will see T-shirts with cartoon stakes. You will hear guidebooks telling a quick, thrilling version of the story between souvenir stops. Tourists snap pictures, laugh, move on. The gruesome human cost names, families, ruined estates becomes background texture. This is not mere disrespect. It is structural forgetting. Economy makes forgetting practical. Disassembling this machinery reveals how memory becomes a tool not only of identity, but of power. Actors who benefit economically, politically, or spiritually have reasons to curate and circulate certain versions of the past. They are the gardeners of collective memory. And once a myth is cultivated, it resists uprooting. Yet the archival traces and the dissenting chronicles mean the edifice is never perfect. The cracks remain visible to those who look. New scholarship, new translations of primary documents, and new artistic works that foreground victims push back. The process of reclaiming those fragments is slow, and it is politically costly. It threatens both cultural revenues and national comforts. If propaganda taught communities how to glorify cruelty when it suits them, then the work of reparation is not merely academic. It is civic. It asks for legal recognition of victims, for curricular honesty, for museums that show both soldierly resistance and domestic suffering. It asks for economies that do not depend on the simplification of atrocity. The next step in our investigation is to sketch the most honest portrait we can give to the man and the maid myth together, not to exculpate or to demonize, but to hold the full, uncomfortable set of truths in view. Because the ways we remember Vlad shape how we accept narratives of the present about security, about sacrifice, about what we will accept in the name of protection. And if the memory machine succeeded in making a monster into a magnet for pride and profit, what does that say about our present readiness to praise brutality when it comes in a convenient package? The answer is urgent, and the echo of it reaches into today's politics. We began with a horrific image meant to shock, a ruler dining beside steaks, a forest of poles as political theater. We followed the tidy school story that turned violence into heroism. We opened Fisher's documents, timelines, voices that refused the tidy account. We entered the grim backstage of power and then watched how a propaganda machine polished the gore into a brand. What remains is an honest, uncomfortable portrait, a man who used terror as policy and institutions that had reasons to recast that terror as virtue. Now a single question short, blunt, and without a safe answer. How many of the people your country calls founders, defenders, or unsparing leaders were celebrated not despite their cruelties, but because those cruelties served someone's needs. Think about the heroes you learned in school. Ask who wrote their textbooks, who profited from their myths, and which victims were named in the footnotes. If you stayed with this investigation, thank you. If this episode unsettled you, subscribe. There are more dossiers to open. Share where you learned Vlad's story, what town, what textbook, and leave a comment about the moment a national tale first felt too neat. We are building a map of memory, and every voice helps point to which parts of the past still need excavation. There are more files. This is only one case among many, and the work of questioning is the work of citizenship.